In this video, I'm going to discuss the remarkable focusing of the attention, certainly in the United States, and I think worldwide, on the conflict in Gaza and in Israel. One of the remarkable things about the last several years has been the ability of the mass media, and I'm including social media and Twitter and various other mechanisms, to steer our attention to a crisis of the moment. We spent over 2 years obsessing about COVID. And then when the vaccines were distributed, which were supposed to be the miracle cure, and of course, most of the people that were vaccinated proceeded to get COVID, or at least they had a test result that produced COVID. Suddenly, COVID wasn't such a big deal. All of a sudden, it was Ukraine, as illustrated behind me, right over here, is Ukraine, which is still a war, by the way. And Ukraine became the big thing for a couple of months. And since then, up until quite recently, Ukraine pops up every few months, gets a kind of saturation bombing. There's a vote, and we send more money and more guns to fight Russia, the other major nuclear power in the world, in Ukraine. And also, there seems to have been a marked increase in concerns about China and Taiwan, and so on. And then suddenly, a little over a month ago, we have this attack in Israel, and suddenly everyone's attention is focused on it. There's lots of issues in the world. Somehow, the media is heavily focused on this. It seems like the availability of smartphones, of high quality audio, video on a device that basically people take with them everywhere, smartphones, iPads, portable laptops, results in or helps to produce a situation where there's an enormous focus on a crisis news story. Now, this has, of course, happened in the days of television. There have been there was the Iran hostage crisis when I was a kid. You know, every night you turn on ABC, CBS, or NBC, and you get, it is day 382 of the hostage crisis. Something that's worth keeping in mind is however strongly you feel about Israel and the Palestinians, the situation there, it's a small issue compared to the war in Ukraine. Not only in terms of the number of people killed and the amount of money spent, but most importantly, the risk of a global thermonuclear war, which, despite the news coverage, is fairly unlikely in a fight between nuclear-powered Israel and the destitute Palestinians. Nor is it very likely that any of the other countries in the region is going to risk being incinerated with Israel's nuclear arsenal by standing up for the Palestinians. They'll talk, maybe there'll be a few incidents. I'm not saying it couldn't escalate. Predicting the future is very difficult. But let's be clear, in Ukraine, since February of 2022, the US and its proxy, Ukraine, are directly confronting the other major global nuclear power, which, according to public estimates, has more nuclear weapons. And these are thermonuclear weapons, like the Castle Bravo bomb shown behind me, that can destroy entire cities and kill millions of people with just one weapon. And both sides have several thousand of these weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles to deliver them anywhere in the world. And we're going at it over a dispute which has now become seemingly a stalemate, with Russian forces in the Russian-speaking areas where you might expect Russia to have support, and the Ukrainian forces, who performed, no one can say that they have not performed much better than anyone expected, but it seems to have achieved a stalemate which is risky every day that it continues. And at least both countries have the power to make an agreement to simply accept the current boundaries and build defensive walls and fortifications and armaments on either side. So if Russia tries to cheat or Ukraine tries to cheat, they're just going to be throwing away their forces against trenches and all the other kind of stuff that's already happening anyway in this pointless war. It has to be a great cost to both Russia and Ukraine and the United States, which has spent over $100 billion officially on supporting Ukraine. It's going nowhere. And yet, every day that it continues, every day that the United States continues to have a hostile relationship with Russia, the other major nuclear power in the world, we are risking global thermonuclear war over what? I don't think Americans are the only people concerned about this. I must believe that Russians are concerned about it. Ilya Prigozhin, one of Putin's advisors, revolted over this, apparently, made some very blunt statements, and died under suspicious circumstances. This is not good for Russia. It is not good for the soldiers of Russia. It is good for very few, if any, people, perhaps a few arms manufacturers. It is risking the destruction of both nations, the complete destruction of Ukraine, for what? Nothing. And yet our attention has been steered away from it by a much smaller and less significant conflict for over a month now. Now, it's true in that month, we've seen some, what looks like maybe backpedaling, some articles in the Wall Street Journal and Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, which seems to have an enormous unexplained control or influence over U.S. foreign policy. Yet we still officially are not engaged in any negotiations with Russia to bring an end to this risky and dangerous and super expensive conflict, which risks the destruction of both nations. Why is that? And why does our media keep suddenly steering us to one crisis after another? Why can't we discuss multiple problems? Why can't we discuss the really substantial problems, like Ukraine as an international security issue is much bigger than Israel and the Palestinians? I feel for the Israelis and the Palestinians, but they're bit players compared to global nuclear war and the conflict between the US and Russia. And yet we have this enormous focus on this never-ending soap opera, which no one, as I said, no one ever seems to want to or actually be able to resolve. So what can you do? Well, steer your attention to other things like Ukraine, like the state of the global and the US economy, which certainly doesn't appear to be all that great. How great is inflation? How much is the price of your food, milk, etc., going up? I think people all over the world need to ask about their economic conditions. Who has benefited from these enormous lockdown policies during COVID, which ultimately appear to have done absolutely nothing other than to enrich certain politically connected companies in the US and elsewhere? Again, we have these crises, often international conflicts, sometimes quite petty, quite small, like Israel and the Palestinians. However passionate they may be about it, the importance of this to most of the world is pretty close to zero. Some, like Ukraine, are more substantial and cause for concern. And I would argue the most worrisome conflict in the world right now is obviously in Ukraine, where again, the armies of Russia, no longer the Soviet Union, the armies of the other major nuclear power are close to coming into conflict directly with the United States. We're arming, training, and assisting Ukraine's army in fighting the Russians. And we have forces in Poland, we have forces in Romania, other places. We've moved NATO very close to the Russian border. We haven't actually made Ukraine part of NATO, but effectively we're coming in to a very close potential conflict with Russia. We're essentially in a major conflict with Russia. This could easily escalate out of control, particularly if there were some strange, unexpected incident like September 11, maybe the use of a nuclear weapon inside of Russia, for example. If somebody were to set one off, let's say around Moscow or somewhere like that, that could trigger a very substantial international crisis, including a possibility of nuclear exchange between the US and Russia. How is Russia going to react if someone does that? I don't know, very likely point at us, just as if something like that were to happen to us, who are we going to look at, right? So this is a very touchy situation that measures should be taken to resolve. It is not in the interest of Russia. It is not in the interest of the Russian people. It's not in the interest of their soldiers. If a nuclear device were to be detonated, it would likely be targeted, just like on 9/11, at the elite. Remember, 9/11 was an attack on the super rich in the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon. You want to really tick people off and get them to freak out. You freak out your elite of your enemy or whoever you're trying to manipulate. So we need to focus our attention not where it's being directed by this weird mass media machine, but think about what's really substantial and important, which includes, of course, the economic conditions we're dealing with. And in closing, I want to point again the extremely narrow coverage of the conflict between Israel and Palestinians in Gaza right now. There are two party lines which are being allowed, apparently, and this applies to Twitter, which is supposedly freer, according to Elon Musk, but we see two allowed party lines that are irreconcilable. One is a ceasefire, which is basically Israel gives up and lets Hamas do these horrible things to them. I think Israel's not going to do that, and everybody knows it. They're going to retaliate with the same brutal vengeance they have in the past that they did against the Nazis that they've been able to find in South America. That's predictable. The other option is we just support whatever Israel is doing. There's no discussion of evacuating the Palestinians, the civilians, women and children. All of these people could be evacuated, for example, into the Negev desert under control conditions where you can make sure that they don't have weapons and so on, and yet they can be provided with food, water, medicine, etc. That's just one example that I've mentioned in previous videos. There are other options, but there's no discussion of bringing in people who are experts in situations where there are hostages or where there are, children or innocent or relatively innocent people, or simply the deluded, like the followers of some crazy cult or whatever. How do you deal with the bad guys while minimizing the loss of life for innocent victims, in fact, caught in the middle? It's a real thing. It happens all the time. Doesn't mean that you don't go after the bad guys. If we had some kind of hostage situation here in the US where some crazies are holding, and I'm saying hostages, we would hopefully want the SWAT teams and people like that to deal with the situation, but not kill the hostages or other people sort of caught in the middle. But there's very, very little discussion, at least that I see, in this mass media machine of any of these other options. We get two. The outcome is likely to be whatever Israel does, it will keep doing for a long time, probably at least a year or more before people get tired of it and it loses attention, just like we've seen in Ukraine or other crises. It goes on for a while, several years go by, and then people start to have doubts. They start to question. They start to simply get tired of it. How long can you stay in your home in a lockdown, right? How long can you keep freaking out about Ukraine before you go, okay, I've got other things to do here. I need to buy food. How does this benefit me? Then we see the attention steered to another, crisis. So in conclusion, we need to steer our attention away from these crises and think of the larger picture and our interests. And certainly one of the things that certainly takes precedence over Israel and Gaza is this ongoing confrontation with the other nuclear power in the world in Ukraine.
This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.